Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, May 4th, 2020. May the 4th be with you. And I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. We got a great show for you coming up, but before we dive into that, I want to thank my patrons this week. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that's because of the support from listeners just like you. If you want to learn more about how you can support the show, just visit patreon.com/talknerdy. This week's top patrons include a new patron, Avril Kolbita. Thank you so much. Welcome to the team. And also, oh my gosh, thank you so much for your generous support. I also want to thank Michael Goucher, Christopher Pitts, Mary Neva, Pasquale Gelati, Ulrika Hagman, Dudas Infinitas, Brian Holden, Daniel Lang, and of course, David J.E. Smith. And remember, there are other ways to support the show. You can visit talknerdymerch.com and pick up some cool Talk Nerdy swag. You can rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, any of the other places where you listen to podcasts, and all of that just goes a long way. Or you can just, tell people about it on social media. Super helpful, especially in the time of COVID-19. Okay, let's talk about this week's show. I had the opportunity to sit down with David Shariatmadari, and he is actually a writer and an editor at The Guardian, but he also studied linguistics at Cambridge and the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. He is based in London, and he has a brand new book called Don't Believe a Word: The Surprising Truth About Language. So yeah, that's what we talk about. We talk about linguistics, language, what it means, how it evolves, and in many ways, like what this global pandemic is doing to affect language and vice versa. So it's super fascinating. I highly recommend the book. So guys, without any further ado, here he is, David Shariatmadari. Well, David, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you for having me, Cara.
Oh, but of course, it's, as we said, it's early afternoon for you because I'm here in California and you are in the UK. Where in the UK are you joining me from?
I'm in London. I'm in a neighborhood called Islington, in my little office room where it's become my office during this lockdown period. The evening sun is streaming through my window as we speak.
Oh, beautiful. What is it like? I mean, I know that this is not at all what we're going to be talking about today, but I'm just so interested, like, what is life like right now in London? We're recording this on April 20th. So how long have you guys been in lockdown, and, what's the general kind of vibe in the city?
I don't even know if I can remember how long I've been in lockdown.
Right.
It's like the days are really blending into one another. I think it's about a month now.
Okay.
I mean, the concern here, certainly kind of among the media class of which I'm a part, was that we were really slow to lock down compared to our some of our European neighbors. And, even when we did lock down, it didn't feel like it was a kind of crunch moment. It felt like it took a while for people to really take it seriously.
Sure.
And like the parks were still teeming with people and so on. And but now I think people are adjusted, and I'm kind of wondering how many people are starting to experience sort of Stockholm syndrome about it. And actually, I mean, for all its hardships, and there are some people for whom it's really, really hard for various reasons to do with health or mobility or whatever. I sort of wonder how many of us will get used to it and then feel the adjustment back is going to be hard. Maybe that's crazy, but I'm beginning to think along those lines.
There's like a comfort kind of in the lack of expectation to present yourself to the world.
Right.
And so I think, and I've always been one of these people who, I do on-air work sometimes, but I still am like really almost resentful of having to get my hair and makeup done before I do on air, because it's just like it feels like a step against entropy that's like pointless. And so, just the idea of like putting on jeans or putting on a blazer and then going out there and like pretense. Something about this is very like mindful and just stripping away a lot of pretense for a lot of people.
Yeah,
so having to kind of
well, the
Yeah,
pressure is off. I think the normal
totally.
rules are suspended, and I think that can feel like there are aspects of that are kind of quite welcome. I think my hair is
Yeah, I think
growing
so.
kind of big at the moment, and my beard is like longer than it. I mean, I don't really have a beard. I have kind of stubble, but now it's a beard.
And I'm in sweatpants, as per usual. Yeah, there is. It's true. I mean, obviously, and as you alluded to at the beginning, this is a very privileged kind of position to say that we're in. Like, oh, I just love being in
Right.
sweatpants all the time. And some people are working; they're essential workers, and they're on the front lines, and they're in danger every
Absolutely.
day. And of course, some people, for them, this is another day without income, and it's just that much more stress and anxiety. But it is kind of it's a new normal, and I think we're starting to see that a lot of the writings, the kind of more insightful, I think, conversations are really about not how do we get back to how we were, but about what is our new normal going to look like, and what's the most responsible way to adjust to develop and then adjust to a new normal. And so it will be. I mean, we're living through history, and you have little ones, right? So it must be very interesting to like try and explain this. Oh, you
I don't.
don't?
I don't. No, I have a niece and a
Oh, I
nephew.
don't know.
So,
Gotcha. Okay.
and they live relatively nearby. So, although, so I have seen them at a distance.
Yeah, sure.
And I've talked to my sister about how they're adapting. I think they're kind of, it still for them feels like they're on a bit of an adventure, but it's tough on my
hmm
sister because she has to look after them all day. Schools are closed.
Yeah, all that
So,
help that a lot of people had isn't there anymore, and just the psychology of kind of like I can imagine growing up and becoming an adult and having this interesting memory of life as a child during that year when the germs were out there and we had to stay home. It's such a
absolutely,
defining.
it's going to be something they tell their grandkids about, right? It'll be a memory. They'll be like, "Oh my god, you remember the COVID-19 thing?" And they'll be like, "Yeah, we had to stay inside for 3 months." There are people alive today who remember the Spanish flu pandemic.
Yes, I was actually going to bring that up. There's this incredible documentary. Well, maybe it was 10 years ago. It wasn't that long ago that there were people alive today. So my grandfather died 8 years. No, my grandmother would have remembered it. And she just died like a few years ago. So she was old. But if there are people who are in their late 90s or early hundreds, they were children then. So there's a documentary on in the US, and I don't know if you guys have access to it in the UK. You might be able to see it on your Amazon, but it's a PBS, which is kind of like our it's our public television. There's one of the really good series on PBS is called American Experience, and it's these like beautiful documentaries about these quintessentially like historical experiences in America. And there's one called I think it's called Influenza 1918 or the Spanish flu. I can't remember. And of course, they talk about how it's actually probably wasn't Spanish. But there are all these really great vignettes of interviews with people who did live through it, because I think it was probably made in the 90s or 2000s. And it's just incredible to hear these elderly people talking about the whimsy and the heartache and like the strange experiences of being a child and seeing coffins in the street or losing loved ones to it. And of course, compared to right now, in some ways, the Spanish flu is much more violent, and there was a lot, and for a lot of people, I think death was a little bit more of a familiar experience
Right.
than because, of course, they didn't have the
Pre-antibiotics.
yeah, they didn't have the
Yeah.
infrastructure, and they
Right.
didn't understand virology really. Like they thought that they could see it. They were trying to look for it under the microscope, which was never going to happen at the time. And but yeah, it's really interesting how these things can be defining for people's lives. Um, And kind of speaking of that, as a linguist, and of course, we're going to get into your newest book, Don't Believe a Word, The Surprising Truth About Language. But as a linguist, kind of a strange, I guess, tie-in, which none of this was happening when you wrote this, is that, there are changes to how we talk about things, that big defining events in culture really do influence our communication strategies. And I'm really interested to know if you've been thinking much about how COVID-19 and how like quarantine and having a quarantini and the COVID or, the Rona or, all these weird things that have come out of this will be part of our society and our culture in the future.
Sure. I mean, I have been thinking a little bit about vocabulary because obviously with every kind of new thing that occurs, particularly if it's a cultural phenomenon, which this has become, there will be a suite of new vocabulary. But it is kind of interesting to think about the way we talk about diseases. First of all, there's the obvious point about linking diseases to a nationality as a way of, this is a horrible thing that's come into your life, and the human instinct is often to sort of try and put that at one remove and try and other it. So, the Spanish flu, the story is that, during wartime in most nations, there was some level of censorship, but there wasn't in Spain. So the news came of the illness mainly from Spain. I believe that's one of the explanations for the reason we called it the Spanish flu. But it's also
because it didn't start there, right? Well, we don't still fully know, but there's some good evidence that it actually started with American soldiers.
I think it started. But that's what I'd heard as well. I mean, I'm not an expert at all, but troop movements were certainly a lot to do with it.
Sure.
But I think that the reason that Spanish flu stuck is for the majority of people affected who weren't Spanish, it was a convenient way of putting that onto someone else. And you saw that, I think, with Trump's attempts to try and make the Chinese virus happen, which he did a few times on Twitter. And, such an appalling thing to do, really.
Really? And the evolution was pretty stark, like from the Wuhan virus to the Chinese virus. And then you had, Chinese American or even Asian American, not even Chinese American individual journalists going to these White House briefings and hearing people call it the Kung flu. Like just very, very racist slurs that were openly used within the administration.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that kind of identifying a pathogen with a nationality is it's a form of racism, really, and it's very likely quite quickly to lead to real world effects. So people,
and it has, it absolutely has across at least across America. We're seeing that,
right.
And not just that, we're seeing violence, threats of violence, and also people getting beat up in the streets because somebody is. So tribal and like you said, so afraid, and they're just trying to find a scapegoat. And when it becomes part of the culture, it becomes, I think for some people, they feel less responsibility because it's like, no, but this is what we're supposed to do. This is okay. My president says it's okay.
Right, exactly.
So
it's
dangerous.
The permissiveness that it's the license he gives people. The other interesting thing, though, for me is the which name will stick, because there are it's coronavirus, it's COVID-19, it's SARS-CoV-2. I mean, I know they all refer to slightly different things, but there's likely to be one item of vocabulary that we rely on the most when we're talking about this thing, and I still feel like we haven't totally settled on that yet. I think coronavirus feels like it may be dominant.
I think you're right. I wonder if it's because it came first in people's consciousness, and it's hard to kind of iterate for some people because it's like, no, this is what I know. This is what I want to stay with. Although it's less specific and it's actually the least kind of scientific moniker. Like SARS-CoV-2 is probably the most accurate, but it's confusing to people.
Right, exactly. And then it's, with COVID, people are kind of saying COVID and dropping the 19, which feels sort of inevitable because, there's only one COVID that people care about, right? So
Yeah.
it's the one that happened in 2019. I think it's not the 19th one. It's Kellyanne Conway, I think, got into trouble for mistaking that the other day. Did you see that?
No, but that's hilarious because I did see a tweet.
So what she did was she was criticizing the WHO or I don't know, international organizations, and she was like, she was kind of trying to say they should have been more familiar with this because this isn't COVID-1, this is COVID-19, so they've had plenty of time to prepare.
Yeah, I was going to say I saw a tweet of somebody talking about funny things that their toddler was saying while they were, stuck at home with them. And they were like, Mommy, did you live through COVID-18 too?
No.
But that was like a 3-year-old. So
right.
That's a little more understandable.
Yeah. Kellyanne.
Oh, no. Oh, geez.
Gotta hand it to her.
An endless reservoir of,
I thought she was supposed to be she was supposed to be like his kind of smart defender. I mean, I don't want to get into politics on your podcast. I don't know how sensitive this is, but be aware, we spectate all of this stuff from afar. So,
and I was actually kind of surprised that not that I mean, obviously you are a journalist and you're abreast of these things, but I always wonder kind of what translates across the pond and like how specific do people get? Like, I assume that maybe you guys know about Fauci because Fauci is like the only voice of reason right now, but maybe you don't know about like certain specific players in our political landscape that don't translate as well. I guess, but Kellyanne's been around a while.
Well, she's a face that you see. I mean, I think as well, because we're not just reliant on traditional media. I mean, those people, someone like Kellyanne Conway is never on the BBC News, but I'll always I'll always be seeing clips of her on Twitter. So
yeah, and I get a lot of my news from Twitter.
Right.
It's just, obviously it's less vetted and there's all the echo chamber issues that we often talk about, but it's also very fast. And I can see some of the specific individual journalists and editors at outlets that I trust and who I will generally read. I can see their takes early and often. And I can also see, okay, if every single outlet that I follow is reporting on this very same story and they're sort of getting it similarly right, this is probably pretty reliable. This is what's happening right now, as opposed to watching a news program, which here in the States, I do think it might be very different than it is in the UK, where all of our news is for profit. It's very hard to find, other than like PBS, which is a public television station. And so a lot of people do rely on that. We might rely on BBC World News because even, I'm really liberal. People who listen to the show know that about me. I'm progressive, but I'm also evidence-based. So, I'm not like wooey about GMOs and like certain things that are liberal causes that I actually disagree with.
Right.
And when I say GMOs, I mean people who are anti-GMO or like anti-vaxxers. They tend to fall on the left too. But I might get my news from PBS, from BBC World News. And I will watch some CNN and things like that. But at this point, like, I don't like 24-hour news cycle.
Right.
It's hard I don't want to turn on the news and hear the same story 17 times in an hour. What's the point of that?
Yeah, it feels like, I don't know whether this is just a kind of subjective impression, but it does also feel like at the beginning of the crisis, and I know that when it's not like we're through the crisis even a significant way necessarily, but it felt like there was so much new information that really actually you could be glued to the news. You could and you'd be getting new information. Whereas now it sort of feels like we have these daily press conferences where members of the cabinet or the prime minister, obviously not recently because he's been ill, but they talk to journalists and give the latest information about the virus and deaths and so on. And they have been becoming less and less informative, I think, just because
there's less to talk about.
There's less to talk about. It's more familiar. So I think there's a kind of slackening off, if you like.
But at least yours are like, I think there's also this historical kind of leadership obligation to sort of show that we're on it. This is what's happening. Even though things out there are out of control, we're doing what we can do to protect you. And there's sort of a comfort that comes in listening to your your leaders talking about kind of what they know, what they don't know, and what their plan of action is. Whereas here, our press conferences are just these like weird advertisements for
Right.
our like president's narcissistic ramblings. And he's like showing like GM ads and he's like campaigning in these press conferences. It's a very different experience. Where like to some people from the outside and even to me sometimes it's comical, but it's like it would be a comedy if it wasn't such a tragedy,
Right.
that kind of a thing.
Well, I think that's the story of the whole Trump presidency, really. It's kind of like,
and it's encapsulated now that he has this airtime where he's like, look, I'm beating the Bachelor ratings, I'm beating Monday Night Football ratings, and it's like, yeah, because your constituency is dying.
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing? And so I was, Boris Johnson, however you feel about him, definitely when I was watching some of his kind of daily briefings that he was doing from his own home, which was the responsible way to do it, I was feeling like, okay, regardless of his politics, because I don't agree with a lot of his politics, that's leadership. Like he's doing what you're supposed to do as prime minister of a country.
There's been a kind of comparison between Boris Johnson and Trump based really on really superficial elements of their style. Yeah. But I mean, the fact remains that like Johnson is an incredibly smart guy. He's a practiced politician. He's highly educated. If there are any Trumpian aspects to his political persona, that's deliberate and that's being deployed in a smart political way. So that's where the comparison, I think, ends between those two guys.
And you could really tell there's, again, regardless of those kinds of political choices or ideologies that, individual politicians have, there's supposed to be, and there always has been historically, maybe even in the States up until I would say the Reagan era, this sense that your leader cares about you, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on. And they're interested in your well-being because they feel a sense of responsibility and obligation to your livelihood. And I'm not getting that here in our country. I think a lot of people are feeling very dejected and kind of saddened by this. Whereas when I was watching Boris Johnson's daily briefings prior to his hospitalization, I was getting that sense from that. I was like, oh man, like he cares about his people, and he wants them to feel okay through this.
Yeah, I mean the response, the political response here from the left would be, well, his party presided over a period where public services and particularly the health service was starved of cash, and so has been left vulnerable to this type of catastrophe. So, I think it's easy. I mean, it's interesting because when you meet Germans or Irish people, and you're like, oh, Merkel, she's great. She's so she's such a statesman. Leo Varadkar, he's so impressive, and they're kind of like, nah, these guys aren't good. She voted against equal marriage, or she doesn't like the idea of it. He's like. He wants to slash welfare and all that kind of thing. So it's interesting the impression that one gets from, because you only ever see as a foreigner, you only ever see sort of the other country's leader being statesmanlike.
True. Yeah. And you can only ever compare it to what you're dealing with in your country. So a lot of times it's like, it's a relative thing. It's like, oh my God, you're so lucky because in the UK, regardless of your political stance, it's kind of like you're never going to get elected if you're like, we should shut down the NHS. You're more like, how much funding are we going to give the NHS? Right, and that's your platform. Whereas here in the States, it's kind of like, oh my God, it's a non-starter that you wouldn't have public health care. Like, I'm so jealous.
Yeah, I know. Well, yeah, it's because I worked in New York for about 9 months in 2016, and
oh wow,
I think I was covering the campaign, so that's probably why I know who Kellyanne Conway is, to be honest.
Right.
But I think the thing that shocked me, I remember a guy in our office needed to have an operation. And his insurance deemed that it was a cosmetic procedure, although it really wasn't. I mean, it was it was a necessary procedure. It was like an orthopedic kind of thing. And his insurance wouldn't cover it. And he sent an email around saying, I've set up a PayPal or whatever,
Yeah, GoFundMe. That's so
GoFundMe.
common now. Yeah.
And I was kind of like, oh God. So this is a journalist, this is like a reporter in my office begging for money for a health condition he has. And that was a real shock for me, because that's not something that would ever occur here.
Because it wouldn't have to. And that's the funny thing. It's like it's the net that if we were to broaden it out on a wide scale, if certain politicians could see the forest for the trees, they would say like, okay, well, that's just people taking the initiative to try and create their own social healthcare system because they physically can't bear the burden from an individualistic, capitalistic kind of perspective. Like, and you're seeing it now with COVID-19. I'm seeing GoFundMe's out the ass for people who can't afford their treatment.
Wow.
Because they're going in critically ill on death's door and then, racking up these hospital bills. And it's like, it's so hard because you get compassion fatigue at a certain point because you're like, everybody is going through this. If only we had a system that would protect them from this. It's amazing. I mean, it's just a strange dystopian world that that Americans are living in. And I think it takes something like a crisis of this magnitude for some of us to really see it. Because when you're going in your day-to-day and you're pretty healthy and you're young and you feel a little bit, immune to the inevitable difficulties of life, you don't realize. And it's easy for you to maintain that kind of individualistic manifest destiny. Why should I pay for anybody else? I don't need the healthcare. And it's so deeply tied into the American ethos that it's a hard thing to kind of, I don't know, to show people. It's strange. And so, interestingly, of course, we're like getting off topic, which I love to do on the show. I do think in many ways this comes back to what you do best, which is, you are a journalist and you cover a lot of different things, but your passion, kind of your early education, is it safe to assume that in some ways your frame, sort of your perspective is shaped by this linguistic view of the world? Like, do you find that there's like these kernels of that in a lot of the reporting that you do?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I guess I'm aware of the power of language to shape perceptions, and actually, I had a kind of supplemental on the talking about the name of the disease. It reminds me as well of trying to find out trying to imagine which name will stick. In the early days of the HIV epidemic, I think that one of the first names for it was GRID, which was gay-related immune deficiency.
Interesting. Yeah, because that's they thought it was specifically targeting gays.
Yeah, I mean, that was the only handle that people had on it. And I think the colloquial version of that, if you like, was the gay cancer.
You're right. There was gay cancer, and then the really pejorative was like gay plague. I think people were using when they were,
and then AIDS, and then it took a much longer time for people to kind of accurately make the distinction between HIV and AIDS.
And so still, some people don't quite get that.
Right, exactly. So the evolution you have is basically, I guess it's often to do with the amount of information that's available. And once a kind of settled view of something is arrived at, then maybe the name will reflect that. But in terms of like your the sort of broader point you're making, does my kind of linguistic sense inform my
like your journalism and what not maybe what you choose to write about, but how you see the world when you write?
Well, I mean, I'm primarily an editor in my day job. I do.
Gotcha.
When I've written, I've done various different kinds of writing. I've done a lot of writing specifically on language as a sort of kind of language guy at The Guardian. But in terms of my editing, I mean, one of the debates where it's been really prominent, or the effect of the frame that you put on an issue is really important is with immigration, debates around migration, and the ease with which people lapse into talking about, the country being swamped or inundated, or the metaphors that are used are often to do with inundation or with a flow of some kind of substance, which is interesting. And that is a metaphor. When metaphors become so routine like that, I think they reflect and partly contribute to a way of thinking about that subject. So
I think so, even if it's completely or at least partially passive, or maybe you can even say unconscious, right? Like this idea that, well, that's just how we talk. And I never really stopped to think about how the way that we talk influences the way that I think about the world. It absolutely does. I mean, I think sometimes people do just use turns of phrase.
Yeah, I mean, there are different levels, I guess. There are certain metaphors that, are really, really deeply embedded in English, which when we don't even really perceive, we don't think of as metaphors. So, like, the fact that we equate understanding something with the visual sense. So, I would say, I see, in order to indicate that I understand. That's a very, very embedded metaphor. And other languages might not do that. At some level in our culture, and speakers of English tend to think of understanding as being about seeing clearly. That's not something that is going to kind of, I don't know, that there's not anything terribly political about that. But if you think of that as the most embedded level of metaphor, and then above that, there are kind of metaphors which are maybe more routine, but you can still perceive that they're a metaphor. And then there are kind of new metaphors that are quite fresh. So in the Brexit debate, I wrote a piece about Brexit metaphors, actually, and there were a whole bunch of metaphors that came along with Brexit to do with the process of Brexit. And it was interesting to see how, in real time, those metaphors were shaping people's perceptions of what the realities were. There was a discussion of a cliff edge Brexit. That was one metaphor that's used. There was what were some of the other ones? There were some that sort of downplay the extent of the rupture. And I'm gonna try and remember one of those, but you carry on while I try and remember.
It's almost like there's, sometimes I think there's intent that we often don't realize, that there's like all actually social psychologists or like a marketing team that's developing phrases. Like we see it a lot in the US with like, the death panels, like when Obamacare was first on the docket and people were like, oh, I don't want death panels and I don't want, and that's kind of like a common refrain in the US is that Democrats like suck at marketing. And like if we had just called it Medicare for all, it would have been like much more palatable for the people who are already utilizing Medicare, which is basically a social medicine program for the people who are very sick, very poor, or elderly. And so, and it's so part of our culture that people accept it and they love it, to the extent that you would see the protesters holding the signs that said like, keep your government hands off my Medicare, which is like hilarious and ironic. And so there's this view that like, if we had just like phrased it differently, that it might have caught on quicker. Whereas you often would see, more in the conservative camp, like very smart marketing. But then there are these other phrases that I think you're right. They almost like more casually just come into being and you can't really track down their origins per se. And we almost don't realize how much influence they have. Like and as journalists and as an editor especially, you must be acutely aware of the fact that like, okay, if you phrase it this way, it's inflammatory. Or if you phrase it this way, even though you don't realize it, you're giving away your political persuasion. But if you phrase it this way, you're actually minimizing the impact. And that could be just as dangerous. So like, it's a game you have to play to figure out what's the most appropriate and neutral way to talk about things that are by no means neutral.
So one of the debates around Brexit was, whether we would leave with a treaty and whether it would be a sort of not a disorganized process, but it would be one governed by treaty, versus just like walking away and not having any arrangements in place. And so, on the one hand, you can call that crashing out. So that was known as a no deal Brexit, basically. But on the one hand, you could envisage that as you can conceptualize that as being a process of crashing out, or the phrase that the supporters of that process used was that it would be a clean break. So a clean break is kind of, yes, it's a rupture, but it doesn't sound bad like the word rupture sounds. It sounds like a new start, something fresh. It sounds tidy. It sounds neat. So, for all of these things that haven't happened yet, and actually no one knows how they are going to play out in reality. And Medicare for All is an example of that. Winning that conceptual battle is so important because you're talking about something in the future. So how you frame it at this point is all there is, and that's why it's so important. So if you have someone talking about death panels, there's no reality to say, okay, look, these guys are clearly not a death panel. What are you talking about? It's just something in all our imaginations at the moment. It's a scenario in the future. So making that scenario, delineating it in a way that serves your political purposes is a huge part of the battle.
Mm. My eyes really opened to that concept, I think, when I was reading this classic psychology book called Prisoners of Hate by Aaron Beck, where he's like a pretty famous cognitive psychologist, which is not actually the orientation that I subscribe to, but of course there's like a lot of brilliance in it, a lot to be learned. And people who maybe have ever been screened for depression or anxiety might recognize the name because they might have taken the Beck Depression Inventory or the BDI or the Beck Anxiety Inventory, the BAI. But he wrote this beautiful book called Prisoners of Hate, where he kind of travels through the evolution. Evolution's probably not the right word to be using. It's not quite accurate, but the ideas, the cognitive ideas of hatred, violence. Ultimately, there is some conversation about racism, but he sort of parallels things like domestic violence with genocide. So he'll go from kind of like the smaller scale violence all the way up to violence at a national or an international scale. And he talks a lot. And I just remember it really hit home for me because as I was reading this book, there was this, quote unquote, caravan that was coming into the US and threatening the borders, and we have to build the wall and all this rhetoric. And I could see the parallel of the utilization of language that Trump had to what Aaron Beck was writing about in like the 80s. I think this book was written in the 80s, where he was talking about dehumanizing language and how when you saw kind of like the Holocaust and the evolution of the Holocaust, kind of in Nazi Germany, that you would see that early on the seeds are set and it's like, how do we other people? And we were talking about this at the very beginning. How do you other people? And then how do you dehumanize them? You use a lot of animal metaphors,
right?
And you use a lot of
insect stuff, right? Yeah, vermin and that kind of thing.
Like vermin, and then like beasts. You saw that a lot with like the racial history around slavery in the US.
Right.
This idea of like animals, and you saw it a lot with colonialism, right? Like jungle things and savages and like these kinds of terms. And in doing that, it minimizes the humanity of the quote unquote enemy. And it really, I think, bolsters those tribal lines. And it's before you know it, a whole group of people are less than in the eyes of another group of people. And that's in many ways shaped purely by language.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's interesting. You've touched on something interesting there. Is it shaped purely by language, or is language... I mean, I think it's almost impossible to separate language and attitude and a sort of collective culture or concepts that we all share. Yeah, that's something that I've kind of I think is still an open question for me, the extent to which language is the determining factor, or language is a reflection of our habits and customs and mores. And I just don't think you can separate them. Language and culture are so intertwined, that they may, there are some aspects of them that you can't unpick. Yeah.
I think my understanding of linguistics is pretty minimal. What I know about linguistics, because I never really studied it academically, is what I've picked up in books, or maybe what I've picked up from studying psychology, because there is a little bit of that in there. So, some basic, interesting Chomsky kind of things about these grammatical units that might be almost not genetic, but almost like inherited. That's not even developmentally paced, right? So this idea that kids would say, like, I go to there, like they would understand these rules even before they can comprehend what they mean. And then, some of this stuff about like symbolic interactionism, this idea that like without the symbols, the meaning is less sophisticated. So like, was language, the early development of language for the human species, central to being able to have abstract thinking and higher level,
right, exactly.
thinking. And so I'm interested, as somebody who's studied this stuff and written about this stuff, really seriously, like how much of that is like pure speculation? How much of it do you subscribe to? Do you think language is essential for thought in many ways?
I think that language is likely to be essential for most abstract thinking. Yeah. I mean, I think one would have to define precisely what one means by thought. I kind of think that, and you as a psychologist may be able to clarify this for me, but if I have if a memory flashes up in my mind, or a memory is provoked by something I smell or something I hear, that is a thought, right? But that really doesn't have to be linguistic, I don't think. I think if there's a perfume that whenever I smell it, and it's obviously, I don't think it's as popular as it was when I was a kid, but occasionally I'll detect it on a passerby, and I'll immediately be back in my school, or in kindergarten, like when I was 4 or 5 or something. And it's an amazing thing. And it's not just a feeling, I can also kind of see the room and see my teacher and so on. And so that to me is not something that requires language, but if I was like planning an event, if I was planning like a surprise birthday party, and I wanted to kind of think about what steps I would need to take in order to do that, I think it would be very hard to do that without some kind of internal monologue, and the use of language to sort of pick a way through the sequence of steps that I would take, right? So
yeah, definitely.
I guess there are different levels to this, but I certainly think higher thought, if you want to call it that, is impossible without language.
It makes sense, right? And the idea that like without naming an object or something that you would interact with in your space, that without having a symbol connected to it or a name connected to it, that you are lacking certain kinds of relational abilities in your thought. It's interesting to think of how much of the way that we speak, at least in English, has to do with physical relation. Like we're often talking about things being over things or under things, or we think around things. Like these abstract ideas that we utilize are linked to a physical directional kind of concrete language, and then we can abstract from there. And it's so funny to me when I actually start to break down how we talk about things, like I'm over this, or can you get out from under that problem? And then you're
Right,
like, wait
these
a
are
minute,
all
what?
metaphors.
Yeah.
These
Yeah.
are all metaphors. I mean, that's the interesting thing. And I think people who have done a lot of work on this kind of stuff, well, there's a school of linguistics called cognitive grammar. A guy called Ronald Langacker have done a lot of work on the structures that those metaphors lend to English in particular, but I think they've worked on other languages as well. But yeah, those are the metaphors that basically just disappear because you don't even think of them as metaphors.
All right, guys, let's get back to the show. Right. Yeah, they're so intrinsic, but really, if you stop, sometimes it's kind of like that thing that happens. I don't know if you've ever, well, and you don't have to tell me, but like for individuals who have ever experimented with like psychedelics, and they have like kind of a breakdown of this like the bounds of reality and the rules and the structures of reality. Or sometimes if you're just as a writer, right, you see the same word over and over, you say the same word like 100 times in your head, it like loses meaning. And
Right.
I think that can sometimes happen when you start to introspect about certain phrases for too long. And you're like, wait, why do I say it that way? I had this experience the other day when I was... Oh, yeah, go ahead.
No, I want to hear about your experience.
I was talking about this idea, and I have a friend who's a linguist, and he was, we were arguing about where the word came from and kind of like what it means to people. But in the English language, and I had an Australian friend point this out to me because she was like, Americans sound like morons when they say a whole nother thing. She was like, what is another? Or what is the word nother? That means nothing. And I was like, I thought it was kind of like unfucking believable. Like you're like breaking the word up and putting a different word in it. But then it also turns out that there's like a lot more complicated linguistic stuff to this phrase that's been around for a really long time. And I now, every time I think about a whole nother, I sound like blathering in my head. So I refuse to say it now. I'm always like, oh, that's another thing, or that's a whole other thing. Yeah, it's been tainted. But some people are like, no, a whole nother is a great phrase. I will always use it. And I say, it's kind of like with me, I'm from the South. So I say y'all. And I think y'all is a brilliant word because in the English language, we're one of very few languages that doesn't have a you plural. We have to use two words for that, which to me is ridiculous. So y'all is like vosotros. I think it's a perfect and, perfectly cromulent word.
Thing. Yeah. And you know, and it's not surprising that English or a certain variety of English has filled that slot because, as you point out, it's a slot that lots of other languages fill. But the whole nother thing is really interesting because it's basically a reanalysis of it's a repositioning of the word boundary.
Yes.
And that's
it's like unfucking believable where you've stuck a word inside of another word, right?
Well, but also because another obviously comes from, the indefinite article an and the word other, right? So the boundary is between an and other, but it's just been reinterpreted in that separation as the boundary being after the a and before the n, right? So you have a whole nother. Now the funny thing that's happened quite a lot in the history of English, because there's always the potential for confusion with the indefinite article and a following vowel. So an example, a really easy to remember example is the word orange, right? Which used to be Norringe. Okay.
Really?
Yeah, it used to be Norringe, and it ultimately comes from a word in Farsi, naranj, which means orange. Okay. And words like that travel with the goods. Like it's very common to import words with a new food stuff or whatever. So it was a Norringe, but there's a potential for confusion there because this is an unfamiliar word now. Does it start with a vowel, and therefore is that an indefinite article before it, an orange, or does it start with the n? So
an orange, a norant, or an norant. Yeah, that's very confusing.
when there was the possessive pronoun in English used to have an n at the end of it. mine.
Oh,
So
sure.
if you said
Mine
that's mine
orange.
orange, that's mine orange, right? Again, there's potential for ambiguity there. So what happens is there's a reanalysis. There's a reinterpretation of where the word boundary is, and that's really common
I
in the
love
history of
that.
English.
Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
it's
Etymology is the coolest thing in the world.
it is cool, isn't it?
It
But I was
is.
gonna. Sorry, I was. I mean, there are other examples of that with the indefinite article. There are like uncle used to be nuncle. So
Nuncle?
yeah.
That's amazing.
So I think in Shakespeare you have my nuncle. I think you have nuncle in Shakespeare. Yeah, there's a bunch of words like that. No, umpire used to be numpire. So like the umpire in tennis was a numpire.
I don't know why that's so funny to me.
It's cool. It's great. But you can go back to your Australian friend and say, well, I'm just participating in a linguistic change as, my forebears did or speakers of English before me did.
This happens a lot. We see it a lot on the other podcasts that I'm involved in, the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. We'll often get feedback from listeners. And I even do a little segment called What's the Words, where I pick a science word that you may have come across when you're reading that's maybe complicated. And I'll break down, like, where did it come from? When was it first used? What does it mean? And how can it be used differently in different fields of science? So like, it's a very kind of wonky kind of terminology segment. But we'll often get feedback from people saying, it's annoying when you say it that way because it's actually the more appropriate usage is this, and we even do it. We infight a lot. There's 5 of us on the show and they're from Connecticut. So they have super weird accents and I'm from the South. So I have a super weird accent. Well, actually I have a pretty neutral American accent. And we'll kind of argue about usage, like preventive versus preventative, or do you actually pronounce the word? It's a primer versus a primer, and then there's always people who will write in and say, no, this is the way it is. And one of our biggest responses is kind of like, yeah, but language is fluid. Like it is the way that the people use it. That's the frustrating yet exciting thing about language is it changes with how it's used. And eventually something that you're almost, really angered you. I remember early on from not a social justice perspective, even though my concentration in my PhD program right now is social justice and diversity. But I was so irritated by the use of them instead of or their instead of his or her because it linguistically irked me. Now I fully accept it and fully embrace it because I think that the social justice perspective kind of trumps the. I can't even use that word anymore. It is more important than the me just being rigid about the usage. But that's right how we say it now. We say they or their when we want to use a non-gender defining word. But early on I was like, oh, it's wrong. Like it's wrong grammatically and I can't do it. But now I fully embrace it.
Yeah,
is that in newsroom style for you guys? Do you use they still, or have you not gone there yet in The Guardian?
We use they if someone prefers to be referred to by that pronoun.
What about kind of the quote royal, like inclusive, kind of like if you don't know a gender or you're talking about, like a person who is gender is not defined, or instead of saying like,
I'm not sure what the Guardian style guide ruling is on that. But
like
I
his
think
or her, you the way to do it, but that's not inclusive enough.
But I think like singular they actually is not as much of an innovation as people think it is. So I think it's been around for a long time. I don't have it on my fingertips, but I'm sure I've read that. So what you'll tend to find is if you look in the Oxford English Dictionary, which is the most comprehensive record of historical usage, like the full Oxford English Dictionary, which is many volumes, you will find examples of they being used to refer to a singular referent, much longer ago than you imagine. And that's the case with lots of words, actually. There's a kind of, there's a linguist called Arnold Zwicky, who I think is in California, but he coined this phrase, the recency illusion, which is kind of useful and actually it's useful way beyond linguistics. But he kept coming across examples of people thinking that things were linguistic innovations, whereas actually, if you look at the data and the attestations, you'll find they're much older than you imagine.
Damn it! There's no such thing as a new idea, is there?
Yeah, right. I think I wrote a list of words that are much older than you think. But there's an example of the word so unfriend came into sort of use recently because of Facebook.
Oh, because of
but
Facebook.
There's actually
yeah.
There's an example of someone saying, would that I would unfriend thee or something, from like 1730 or something. So,
this is the stuff memes are made of. I love that. That's so great.
One thing I was going to ask you about when we were talking about concepts, though, because I've recently read a kind of mind-blowing book by Lisa Feldman Barrett. Have you come across her, or is it Lisa Barrett Feldman? So she's a psychologist, but Lisa Feldman Barrett. So it's called How Emotions Are Made.
Okay.
And
yeah, I'm looking her up now.
She presents the classical view of emotions, which is a sort of emotions are essential, right? Anger, they're universal, and there's some kind of physiological fingerprint for the different basic emotions like anger, fear, sadness, or whatever. So her framework is constructivist.
Yeah, so I've been studying a lot of constructivist psychology lately. It's
right. Okay. So I'm sure it's kind of applied in lots of different domains. But so her idea is that actually there are no basic emotions, there are no universal emotions. We label certain states in certain ways, and that's culturally and linguistically dependent. So, we will label a kind of particular bodily state. We'll give it the name anger in our culture, but it might be given, it might be mapped, or it might be designated by a different word in a different culture, and it might not map onto what we think of as anger. So the idea is that all of, emotions are created essentially. The only kind of basic parameters are like arousal, so low arousal versus high arousal, and pleasantness versus unpleasantness. And beyond that, nothing is universal. So, sadness, no matter how kind of fundamental these emotions might feel, or the idea of like pride or excitement or whatever, none of those things are actually universal. They're culture-bound concepts.
And you'll see a lot of that in psychopathology and in therapy, this idea. And I'm more of a constructivist thinker, not when it's so much when it comes to like the scientific method, but definitely when it comes to diagnostics and to, I subscribe to, I'm an existential psychotherapist, and kind of a fundamental view there is like, you don't diagnose unless you absolutely have to for like healthcare purposes, because we think that like in pathologizing the client, you start to overlook like very, subjective and kind of personal strengths and things, and you start to only see them as, and they start to often only see themselves as this pathology, which is actually a construct in and of itself. And because it's like syndrome based, it's like different than medical science, psychological science, but in some ways it's not.
I think that Feldman Barrett would say someone who has a diagnosis is introduced to a concept which then informs the way they think about themselves, and actually sort of has its own effects on the way they are in the world and the way they feel about themselves.
Which, and that's not to say that it's necessarily always negative. Like it could be pathologizing or stigmatizing. It could be liberating, right? And I think that's actually the basis for an entire type of therapy called narrative therapy, which is all about helping clients rename their problems and externalize their problems so that they can better cope and figure out how to live with them. So like it was born out of child psychology, where the famous example is that a little kid who had enuresis, which is peeing the bed after a certain age, right? You're supposed to like learn how to control that, and sometimes it can be tied to psychological issues if there's like an early abuse history or something. And so this kid was peeing the bed, and instead of calling it enuresis or saying like you are peeing the bed, you have this thing wrong with you, they would rephrase and rename it like the sneaky wee is coming up at night and it's getting me. And so in externalizing it that way, it became this thing that they could better cope with and better talk about, and eventually better learn either to live with or to ultimately change in such a way that that it was no longer a problem. And so that those narrative therapy things do come in for a lot of people. Like instead of talking about my depression, they might talk about, the bad thoughts, or when the monster comes out at night, or whatever the case may be. It can actually help for certain people them cope with those things. And again, it's just, you're right, it's a change of language, but it's actually a change of like fundamental perspective. It shifts how you think about the world.
You reconceptualize it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's really interesting. And yeah, I've had a lot of, I've known a lot of therapists, and I've seen a lot of kind of, especially more recent research along the vein of like, is anger really different from sadness? Or is it just a way that somebody might conceptualize it? And some people, when they're very sad, they are angry towards themselves. Some people are angry towards others. Some people cry. Some people yell. Some people, but are these all just different like iterations of kind of a similar flavor of ice cream? I don't know. It's such a hard thing to study, but it's an interesting cognitive psychology kind of approach. I love that language is so kind of fundamentally intertwined into psychology, neuroscience, sociology, anthropology, and really, honestly, you could expand that. It's fundamental to every field of science and really every academic field, because you can't even communicate without language. But you know what we haven't done yet, David, is we haven't really talked about the thesis of your book.
Oh, yeah.
Which I want to talk about with you. So the title,
Sure.
at least in America, is Don't Believe a Word, The Surprising Truth About Language. Is that also the British title of the book?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
that's
they liked it. They liked it enough to carry it over.
Nice.
Which is good.
So, I mean, I have to ask, and it's probably the most obnoxious thing that people ask you when they interview you, is like, I mean, that's quite an open question. Like, what is the surprising truth about language? How do you approach that throughout the book?
Well, it's interesting you ask about my book's thesis, because it's not a book with a central idea that I'm trying to convince you of. I mean, it has an element of that. That's one part of it. But really, it's a kind of invitation to linguistics, and an invitation to sort of pick over the gems and the insights and the discoveries that have been made over the last, in some cases, century, but, in a lot of cases, much more recently than that. The idea was that I feel like people really love to talk about language. They have a fascination with it, but and this isn't meant to sound condescending at all. I think it's just because of the lack of access to this information. It's quite an unschooled way of the ideas that people have about language are kind of unschooled in a way, and untutored, and through no fault of their own. Because I just think that linguistics as a discipline has acquired this reputation as being hard and kind of dry. And I was just struck by the contrast between that and the extent to which people get really excited about language and really entranced by it, in the way that I heard you kind of express some of that when we were talking about orange and
yeah,
because it's like
no
this
way.
stuff is fascinating. It's like, this is this thing that I use every day, and actually, like, I don't understand how it works. I don't necessarily understand how these things fit together, and there are these surprising phenomena that I've never quite understood. And tell me about that, please. So that's the idea. If there is an idea behind the book, that's the idea. And I've kind of whimsically taken some possible myths or misconceptions about language, and they are that's how I divide it into chapters. So it's like,
Gotcha.
The title of each chapter is like a myth or an idea that you might have about language that I then kind of debunk or use as a jumping off point to sort of get into some of the meat of the subject. So the first chapter is language is going to the dogs, which is like an incredibly widespread and tenacious feeling that people have about language, that it's deteriorating. And I explain why that's not the case. And the second chapter investigates like word origins and how a word's origin is often taken to be its true meaning, but actually that's not really where meaning resides. That's not what meaning is. If someone kind of tells you, well, the Latin, that comes from the Latin, so you're using that word wrongly, it's not how it works. And it's quite easy to demonstrate that because the origin of some words is really unexpected. And words change, like, as we discussed before. So in the word nice, if you go back to the 12th century, that meant foolish or ignorant. So, no one would say, oh, you're using nice wrong, because, in medieval times, it used to mean foolish. But they do that with some words, particularly when they relate it back to ancient languages like Latin or Greek. There's a kind of tendency to do that, isn't there? It's like an appeal to authority, but it's totally fallacious.
No, you're so
anyway,
right. And it speaks to, I have to say, like, it speaks to this idea. And again, I'm going back to the SGU, this other podcast I work on, where we have this running gag on the show where when somebody writes in or when we want to be pedantic, we actually say pendantic. And I think it actually started before I ever joined the show. Somebody misused the word and it was really like ironic and funny. So now we say it all the time. We'll be like, not to be pedantic, and we still to this day get people emailing being like, you're misusing that word. And we're like, yes. But it's so true. Like this need to be pedantic, to kind of say like, well, actually, let me tell you that the true meaning or the real roots say this. So, not to be pedantic, but you're actually utilizing that wrong. People want to do that because they feel like superior or something, but it's like, well, you know what? I'm using it the way people use it. And that's really the meaning.
But it's interesting. It's also two different ways of conceptualizing language, right? One is that it's a means of communication, and it's a means to an end. You're using language to do something, and that's what language is for. Versus the idea that language is a kind of special code or secret repository of kind of arcane knowledge. And I think it's interesting that there are just these different conceptions of language, and one is really seductive, and that's the kind of language is this hidden set of keys or something, but it doesn't really work, because as soon as you kind of prod that structure, it sort of falls apart, right?
Yeah, and it is this like. I'm drawing parallels because, of course, that's a common, cognitive kind of strategy is like I'm drawing parallels between what we're talking about and like what some of my schemas are from my fields of inquiry. And, being a scientific skeptic, but also being somebody who lately is studying social justice and constructivism in a real kind of academic way, I'm always trying to square those two circles. And I think we try to apply like logical positivism or these like kind of early ways of thinking or ways of knowing to different fields to say, I want rules and I want to think in a black and white way. I want everything to work the way that like physics works. And like some people will be kind of at that end of the spectrum. And then other people are like, no, nothing is anything until we tell it what it is. And they want it to be very kind of like new agey and wooey. And like there is something in between when it comes to almost all fields of academic inquiry, but it's that existing in the gray area and being comfortable in nuance and ambivalence, which is very hard for people. I think it's uncomfortable, but then once you can kind of find the joy and the interest in the discomfort, for me personally, at least, and this is coming from a therapist view, it opens up a lot of, I think, positive and beneficial experiences, like cognitive and intellectual experiences.
For sure. Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I might just be talking out of my ass. Using language to talk out of my ass for 36 years. So yeah, I mean, I think it's really cool the way then that you've decided to kind of lay out a topic that honestly for me feels like it would have been really overwhelming as an author to sit down and say, okay, this is what I'm interested in. This is what I've studied. I want to kind of make a guide for people, or like help them kind of approach some of these conversations about maybe what you think you know about language you don't know, or maybe you're thinking about it differently than the academics think about it. So let me give you an entree that's still palatable. I mean, how on earth did you approach that and say, what am I going to include? What am I not going to include? And how am I going to organize my thinking about this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I suppose one thing I should point out is that it's not, the book isn't just a kind of primer on what academic linguistics is. It's actually relatively idiosyncratic in terms of what I cover, and what I've been guided in terms of what I covered by my own kind of pet, my favorite bits of linguistics, because I can do that because I'm the author, so I decided to do that. But also by what I think the kinds of questions that people used to ask me, the kind of things that come up again and again when you're talking to people about language. So it's things like, well, how does meaning work? Or is it true there are words that you can't translate? Or like, do animals have language? Or, are some languages more technical than others? Or are they more sophisticated than others? I think I wanted to be guided by the kind of big questions that people do ask, but then take them and look at them in a sort of hopefully more sophisticated way. But in doing that, I haven't actually mapped out the standard domains of academic linguistics. I've got
so it's not like Linguistics 101 in a book.
No, it's not like, I mean, it's not like syntax, semantics, pragmatics, etc.
Oh God, I'm already like, what?
So the sort of, the first year linguistics curriculum, there's quite an established set of domains that linguistic study takes place within. And it's not that. I mean, it's kind of skewed. For an academic linguist, they would probably think it was skewed in favor of semantics, and so the study of meaning, and historical linguistics, so how language evolves, which certainly historical linguistics is sort of a poor relation in academic linguistics, or has been, certainly for much of the second half of the 20th century. Historical linguistics, which during the 19th century was the whole of linguistics. So this is like studying how language changes over time. It was known as philology then, and that was all linguistics was, up until basically it was kind of trying to work out how languages were related, and the way you did that was by sort of tracing back sound changes until you could kind of identify common ancestors of words.
Oh, right. So it's like getting back to the PIE.
Yeah, Proto-Indo-European. But even, before that, there was a whole bunch of work to be done to establish whether German was related to Swedish or whatever, And so all that work was done in the 19th century. And that was all there was to it. And then you had Ferdinand de Saussure, a Swiss linguist, who actually said, hang on, let's look at language in the now. Let's look at what it means to have knowledge of language for a person in the present. And So he drew this distinction between diachronic linguistics, so language across time, and synchronic linguistics, language as a system in the here and now, a set of knowledge that a speaker uses. So synchronic linguistics then took over, and then particularly kind of in the second half of the 20th century with Chomsky, the focus was entirely on what it meant to have knowledge of a language. So that's totally
so almost like an epistemological language.
It's what does knowing a language consist of in terms of what are the rules that one's brain has access to that allows one to produce a certain set of well-formed sentences.
It's so funny because that happens, I think, in a lot of fields where like the advent of kind of like the century of the brain and like learning more about neuroscience, it's like, how do I apply this? How do I apply this? And how can I make sense of what we now know? And so there's this like almost like pushback to this very cognitive kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Like this very cognitive era in the field. And then ultimately we've ended up, I think in a lot of fields, into this more postmodern constructivist kind of like what's real is real to the person view. Has linguistics kind of been going that route as well?
Well, linguistics was so dominated for such a long time by Chomskyan linguistics, which in itself was a sort of backlash to behaviorism. But so I would say that there's probably a loosening of the grip of Chomskyan linguistics, which is allowing kind of many more flowers to bloom. I don't know whether you can quite call that a sort of postmodern situation or not. It's kind of maybe post-Chomskyan or whatever. But I mean, I guess my point was that through that whole process, starting with de Saussure, and that was like the beginning of the 20th century, historical linguistics was not seen as the cutting edge any longer. But it's always been, for me, the question of how languages change and the forces that determine the shapes of language, the shapes of languages. That's always been really, really interesting. And I think a lot of lay people find that really interesting as well. It's like, well, why is this word like this? And why is the related word like that in French? And how did that happen? And, why are young people changing this construction so it means this? And, all that kind of thing I think is really fascinating. And I think there are some really interesting things you learn about language as a system if you study how it changes. It's like a dynamical system. It's subject to these kind of crazy emergent patterns and so on. I find all that kind of thing really cool. So so there's a slant in my book towards that kind of thing.
I love that. I mean, it arises for me two questions. The first one being, is the way that your thinking has been organizing about this, obviously you're trained in this way academically, but you've also been working as a writer and an editor for a long time. And so, you see in some ways, because you are working as in many ways, a linguistic conduit to the world. Like there's this, the press is taking these concepts and distilling them for people to be able to understand what's going on. But also in more modern media, there's a feedback loop, right? Because you see comments and you hear letters to the editor, and there are these things that you're seeing how these things are perceived by people, and you kind of have a better finger on the pulse of like what interests people than maybe somebody who isn't sitting in that position. So I'm wondering, one, is kind of your book informed by the work that you've done as a journalist and editor? Is there sort of this like positive feedback loop there? And two, I don't remember what my second question was, but that's okay.
That's fine. That's enough to be getting on with.
Right.
Yeah. I think it definitely is. I think that as an editor, you find yourself kind of with quite sensitive feedback from, I mean, the feedback mechanisms we have now are quite sensitive and responsive, and you can tell what people are interested in. You can see what kind of things go viral. You can, you can clearly see what people's preoccupations are, the things that they don't feel they've got satisfying explanations for. So I think absolutely, it's kind of informed probably some of the topics that I focused on, and maybe even the structure of the book.
Right.
Yeah, because, I mean, I've written columns about language, and I've seen the kind of responses that they get. And for sure, I wanted to, I mean, what I'm doing is a form of science communication, really. And I suppose my qualifications are more in the communication area than they are in the science area. So, because I don't have a PhD, I'm not an academic, I'm not involved in research. But what I can do is kind of do my best to appraise what the thinking is around different aspects of the way language works, and then kind of communicate that.
Right. You're almost doing observational field studies in your day job.
I guess so. Yeah, I guess so. That's one way of putting it. Yeah. But, I mean, I think I wanted the book to be academically credible in the sense that I didn't want it to contain mistakes, obviously. I wanted, but it was quite a difficult balancing act to perform. And I was conscious of this through the writing of the book. I was sort of serving two audiences, and it was, as much as the book is a kind of an act of science communication and very oriented towards an audience of lay people, it's impossible not to write something like this and have sitting on your shoulder the embodiment or the spectre of academic linguistics and what they're going to say about it. And are they going to say it's, lightweight, or he's got this stuff wrong, or, so I had to kind of serve two masters in that sense. And that was quite a tricky balance to strike in, at some point. But I think that's the dilemma of all kind of popular writing about science. I mean, it's the, you're either going to produce something that people say is impenetrable and too difficult, or you're going to produce something that people say is dumbed down. I don't know.
And it's always going to be those people from those edges. Yeah, that's a common thing with SciComm. It's kind of like you want to be understandable. Yeah, because you want to be understandable to the point where you don't lose accuracy. Like, I want to, and for me, that's why I always say when I'm like kind of teaching about SciComm, or when I'm giving talks about SciComm, I have these top 5 rules of SciComm. And I think my number 2 or 3 is always never underestimate the intelligence of your audience, but always underestimate their vocabulary. So like, I don't want to dumb down concepts, because I think conceptually a lot of this stuff is really accessible. It's just that we use this impenetrable verbiage in academic circles that makes it so that, it's sort of like a barrier to entry. And again, it's not academics that does that. Every field does that. There's a reason for it. It's a shorthand, right? It's so that we can communicate with each other instead of circumlocuting every single fucking concept. But it's the reason that you can't understand a damn word your plumber or your electrician says either. I don't know what any of those things are. Yeah. And so that's what SciComm is all about, right? It's like talking conceptually without talking like lexically in a way that's impenetrable, it's a tall order. It's an art. And writing a book is probably one of the best ways to learn it. I haven't ventured on doing that yet. I was involved in writing the SGU book, but I haven't taken on like sitting down to do. I mean, it scares the living piss out of me. It seems like so much work. Did you enjoy the process, or are you one of those people who's like, I hate writing, but I love having written?
No, actually, it's interesting because I did enjoy the process. Which I didn't necessarily expect to do. I think that because I was working, I had a full-time job throughout. And so I wrote this book in my spare time, essentially. And I thought that would be
As you do.
overwhelming.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, I mean,
like
I thought it would be. It was easier than I thought, I'm not claiming any kind of special like prowess on my part for that. But it was easier because actually, what I thought would be overwhelming and added stress was, in fact, a bit of a respite from my regular work. It was sort of like, oh, now I get to do this, and I can use my mind in this totally different way, and actually, that feels like a break.
Oh, right, because you're not writing as much. You're an editor. So you're editing other people's work, and this is you getting to produce.
Yeah, there's that, but it's also a very different... I mean, even if I had been writing more regularly, it's such a different... It's like extremely long form compared to journalism, compared to, short form journalism. And it's totally different pace. And then it was just a totally different domain to what I was working on during the week. I mean, it's just like
what are you? Just by the way,
subject.
Like totally. What is it in your job at the Guardian? Like what do you edit? Are you on a particular
I'm
desk?
the opinion editor.
General assignment? Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I love that.
Well, it's certainly...
that must be so much more interesting.
It's a generalist job in the sense that it's like people have opinions on everything. So, I mean, at the moment it's mostly coronavirus. But it could be social policy, or it could be foreign policy, or it could be, a pop culture trend or whatever. So it's pretty diverse, but this felt like it was time completely apart from that. And, so, and it's just very slowly paced. Like it accumulates over like more than a year. And so it never feels like you're doing a huge amount of work at any one time. Where it gets to feel a bit more burdensome is when you're dealing with the iterations of the finished, in inverted commas, manuscript. Because then you do have this book and you're like, okay, now I have to read this whole thing again to check for errors, or I have to go through and like make these edits. And
that sounds, tough. I mean, it sounds to me like perhaps, there is something to the adage that like, and I don't know if this is an adage, so I don't know why I said that, but if you love something, it feels less like work. Like if you're fundamentally interested in the topic, then it's less Sisyphean, like, because you want to be like rolling that ball up the hill. Like it's like, ooh, this is fun for me.
I think
so that helps a lot.
It would be really hard to do if you didn't have an appetite for it, if you didn't feel like a certain sense of excitement about doing it.
And that's why they always say in book publishing, like, write the book that nobody else could have written, write the book that only you could have written, because it's your perspective and your taste and your interest area. And that's, it's quintessentially you, as opposed to trying to sit down and write, somebody else's book. So I have to say, because I've been keeping you so long, one of the things that I do love about your approach, and so I'm interested in your take on whether or not you self-identify this way, is that you do have, in my opinion, as a scientific skeptic, a skeptical viewpoint, in that you debunk things and you help kind of get to the bottom of things. And like, this might be the conventional wisdom, but let's try and think about it a different way. Do you consider yourself like a skeptic, a skeptical thinker?
That's interesting. I mean, I don't like identify as a skeptic particularly. I mean, it's not like a badge I wear or anything, but I guess my response to new information is generally to kind of, think, okay, what do I think about this? What's the evidence? Yeah. I'm not credulous. I tend to hold back on my judgments about things until I've done some thinking and gathered some information. So if that makes me a skeptic, then sure. Yeah, I don't tend to...
and you want evidence.
I want evidence. I guess I'm a bit of a sucker for sort of academic authority as well. So, you can read a very clearly expressed informative article about something on a popular news website, but I'll be like, okay, I want to see the paper that this is based on, and I want to know what the journal's impact factor is, or whatever, or I want to know that it's like a respectable journal, that kind of thing. So
you're one of us.
Okay. There we go.
I love it. I love it.
I'll wear my badge now with pride.
Yes, please do. There's so many more things I could ask you because this is such a fascinating topic and we've only scratched the surface, but hopefully that has encouraged a lot of people listening to the show to pick up the book and, learn more. I close every episode by asking my guests the same two questions, and they're pretty big picture questions. So I was hoping that you'd be game and you'd want to play along a little bit.
Sure.
All right.
Go ahead.
So I want you to, good. I want you to think about the future in whatever context is, kind of relevant to you right now. So obviously there's a lot going on with COVID-19, but there's also, personal stuff and career stuff and global issues. You could go to the cosmic level. Some of my guests do because they're, string theorists or whatever. But I want you to tell me first, what is the thing that keeps you up at night, like the thing that is most disconcerting? Maybe you're a little bit pessimistic, borderline cynical about, like you're legit worried. And then on the flip side of that, so that we end on kind of a more positive note, what is the thing that you are looking forward to in, an optimistic kind of authentic way, like not paying lip service, but you're actually like, things are looking good in this regard. What are those two kind of extremes for you?
Wow. Okay. So
you can take a minute.
In terms of the thing that keeps me up at night, are you you're using that metaphorically to think about like what's the thing that I'm most concerned about in terms of
like what is bothering you,
as opposed to actually what keeps me up at night is when I wake up and I kind of think of, I think we should change the headline for this piece that we published,
right?
Or I need to call the columnist, whichever columnist, or that's the actual stuff that I wake up thinking about.
That physically keeps you up at night.
Yeah. I guess I'll probably, because we all have personal concerns versus societal concerns, and then, like as you were saying, kind of cosmological concerns. I'll probably talk about society, I guess, and our future, our shared future. I think that my biggest concern is definitely the climate, and how we're going to adapt to that, and whether sort of advanced society and advanced civilization can be maintained, or whether we will kind of descend into sort of whether entropy will take over. And the kind of, I think what's interesting about COVID is that, well, there are lots of interesting things about it, but one of the things that I think it is exposed is how thin the veneer of functioning normal civilization, supply chains. I'm kind of obsessed with supply chains at the moment.
Right, and, like the structure of civilization.
How we get things, how we move things around, all the advances that we're used to taking advantage of, whether that's like different medicines or, things that enhance convenience in everyday life and all those things. It's become kind of easy to imagine them being disrupted, right?
Sure. Almost like there's this ecology of society, like we've long known
actually quite delicate. It's quite
that like
delicate.
One thing changes and you have this downstream effect that like it's not as simple as just adding something or removing something.
So if you think about the kind of level of disruptions that we might be facing in terms of climate change, I worry about that, because I worry that the really amazing fruits of our civilization, scientific endeavor, and amazing technological things we've been able to achieve, I worry that those will maybe be at risk.
Right. And on the whole, we'll still not like putting... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, like an advanced university system and an advanced system of research labs is kind of the last thing that a society is able to achieve in its sort of development. And if we're faced with sort of actually really basic things are threatened, then you lose all of that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anyway, so that's what keeps me up at night. And then
it makes sense. Yeah, for sure.
The thing that gives me some hope is, I suppose, human ingenuity to solve those kind of problems. And I think, I mean, one thing that's amazing is that the extent to which renewable energy has become much cheaper because, per unit, because of technological advances and smart people doing things to benefit humanity. And I guess that kind of thing is what gives me hope that we'll maybe be able to overcome it. I got obsessed for a while with this, and I don't know whether I'm kind of, maybe this sounds like free advertising for them, but I kind of got obsessed by the story of the Impossible Burger.
Oh, I am too. Obsessed.
Right. And it was I don't know if you ever listened to the Freakonomics podcast.
I have heard snippets of that conversation. I too have interviewed. His name's Pat Brown, right? The founder of, and I've interviewed him for different TV shows and stuff. And it's weird. It's the same thing. Like I talk about Impossible a lot. They don't pay me. I just actually really love the burger, and I love I
haven't tasted one yet. It's not available here.
Oh my God, you have to. Oh,
no,
come,
I have
come.
to.
Well, you can't come visit because
I can't at the moment.
Planes are closed. Yeah, but soon, come visit. Come to LA. I'll take you out for a really good burger at like Umami or something, and you'll experience the full Impossible. I've been to the factory and stuff. I love it. I love Impossible Burger. Yeah,
yeah. So that's that kind of thing, and that story I heard on that podcast of him being like, well, what's the biggest difference I could make with my expertise and the amount of kind of capital that I have to invest or whatever. And he's done something that could have a big ripple effect. So,
and like he cares, like it's like fundamental to how he sees the world. Like this is something that it's not just like it's not just an economic decision, although that's a big part of it because he's a pragmatist, but it's also like you said, what is the biggest positive effect that I could have, because this matters. Like eating beef is bad for the environment. Like we know this, we can measure the carbon footprint of this. So how can we reduce that?
But the things I get excited about are things like technologies like direct air capture of CO2. And if that was something that were able to be scaled up and were made to make a difference, that would be an extraordinary example of human ingenuity and research and diligent work, helping us survive, basically. So I've got some faith in human civilization's ability to rescue itself, but it's faith that is tested quite often, Cara, on a daily basis.
No, I feel you. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, you sometimes have to search to find those stories, unfortunately. And they're there, but you're right. They often get buried in the noise of kind of the opposing views. And, shameless plug, because I'm about to shamelessly plug you as well. But I'm not getting paid from this anymore, so I feel less bad about it. But I was involved in a podcast last year, 2 years ago, called Fixed That For You. And I think we only did like 6 or 8 episodes. I was basically the narrator, like the host of the podcast. But that's really what it was. It was these stories, global stories of individuals across the globe who saw a problem and decided, I want to figure out how to fix this using like data and algorithms. And so there's like a really beautiful story of a young man in an Indian village where there's a massive influx of people for a big festival every year and people were getting trampled to death. And he was like, how can I make it so that we can peacefully assemble without these like negative consequences? So he developed this mat that like counts the number of people, and when you reach critical capacity, the police can come in to peacefully disperse, and it actually like saved lives. And there's a woman who like developed an artificial pancreas because she was tired of waking up in the middle of the night every night to test her blood sugar. And so there's like these little beautiful stories about that kind of basic human ingenuity. And I don't think we get enough of that, right? And that's one of the kind of powers of like of literature, of these kind of nonfiction books, like the book that you wrote, of podcasts, is that it gives us a window to these things when we're sort of inundated with just like COVID-19 news all day, every day.
Right. But then there's a story happening now about how there are people working away to develop a vaccine. There are already loads of trials for treatments. It's amazing seeing that kick in so quickly as well, and knowing that that's going to be what saves us. And that there
and
are
the
people.
antibody tests. Yeah, I mean, these things are so important. That's what I read about in the news. I don't really read the the story after story. That's just like the same reporting. But yeah, what's new? What's happening? What can we trust? What can't we trust? And I don't know. It's a lot, but I really agree with those sentiments that like it's very easy to look out the window and to watch the news and to be aware, to watch documentaries and be aware of the suffering in the world and say, we are not long for this world. Like it's very easy to get eschatological. But at the same time, those stories of change and pure kind of ingenuity and also I think morality, they exist in the world. They don't sell as many clicks, which is why I don't think we see them as often. That's the right, that's the news calculus, but they're there and they are really uh, uh, inspirational. I agree with that wholeheartedly. Well, gosh, David, thank you so much for being here. I feel like we could have continue to talk for another hour and a half, but it's getting late where you live, and that would be cruel and unusual of me. Guys, the book is Don't Believe a Word, The Surprising Truth About Language, and it's available, wherever you buy books because it's been out for a bit now. David, thank you for being here. It was incredibly informative.
Well, you're very welcome. It was great to chat with you.
Yay. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.